The Bugatti had been dead for 8 days, and the most expensive people in the room had started lowering their voices. It sat beneath the chandelier in the grand pavilion of Hartwell Motors like a $3 million confession nobody wanted to make out loud. The paint was a deep Atlantic blue, polished so perfectly it caught every crystal of light above it, but the engine had not made a sound since the morning it arrived. 8 days. $500,000. 12 specialists flown in from 3 cities. 4 technical teams with hard cases full of diagnostic equipment, factory tablets, replacement modules, calibration tools, and the kind of confidence that usually came with invoices no one questioned. None of it had mattered. The car remained silent. 40 feet away, Evelyn Hart stood with an empty champagne glass in her right hand and a smile that had stopped reaching any part of her face. At 29, she had built Hartwell Motors into the kind of company that did not apologize for being expensive. The pavilion around her proved it. White stone floors, black steel columns, glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago, waiters moving quietly between investors, and a velvet rope around a vehicle that was supposed to become the centerpiece of an $80 million European partnership before the end of the night. Instead, the Bugatti sat motionless while important people pretended not to stare. Preston Vale, Hartwell's head engineer, stood beside the diagnostic station with his sleeves rolled halfway up and his jaw locked in the careful shape of a man who had run out of useful theories. On the tablet in front of him, most of the fault history had been cleared, tested, reset, and cleared again. One line had returned 3 times in 8 days, appearing briefly before vanishing under a cascade of larger warnings: transport mode interruption. Preston had seen it. He had dismissed it. A car like this did not fail because of something that small. That was what he told himself. That was what $500,000 in specialist labor had taught the room to believe. Evelyn looked at the watch on her wrist. The signing presentation was scheduled in 50 minutes. Martin Keller, the senior European technical representative, had already stopped making reassuring comments. The guests had stopped asking whether the car would be ready. Silence had begun to spread in the spaces between conversations. Then the service door opened. A man in a gray work shirt stepped into the pavilion holding a 5-year-old girl's backpack in one hand and a small canvas tool bag in the other. His name was Nolan Mercer, though almost no one in that room knew it yet. His daughter, Emma, walked beside him with a blue toy car held against her chest, the same color as the Bugatti under the lights. Nolan paused just inside the door, not because he was impressed, but because he heard something the room had stopped listening for. A relay clicked once beneath the rear bodywork, late by half a second. His eyes moved from the dashboard flicker to the diagnostic tablet to Preston Vale. Preston saw him and went still. The only man in the building who recognized the real error had just walked in for a signature on an unpaid invoice. Nolan had not come to Hartwell Motors to save anyone's partnership. He had come because the finance office still owed him $940 for a transport inspection he had finished 11 days earlier, and rent did not wait for luxury companies to organize their paperwork. Emma's sitter had cancelled that afternoon with a fever, so Nolan brought his daughter the way he had brought her to job sites before, quietly, carefully, with snacks in the side pocket of her backpack and a coloring book folded under his arm. He was 33, lean from work rather than exercise, with short brown hair, light stubble, and the tired calm of a man who had learned to solve problems before talking about them. His gray work shirt had a clean patch where an old company badge used to be. His boots had been wiped before he entered, but the soles still remembered shop floors, loading docks, and cold service bays. Emma stayed close to his left side, her blue toy car pressed against her jacket. The toy had come from a parts vendor 2 months earlier, a cheap plastic model that looked enough like the Bugatti for Emma to decide it was special. Nolan had told her not to touch anything in the pavilion, not the velvet ropes, not the glass stands, not the cars, and she had nodded with the serious obedience of a child who knew her father could not afford mistakes. Preston Vale crossed the floor before Nolan reached the finance desk near the service corridor. He moved quickly, but not loudly, because too many investors were watching. "You are not supposed to be in here," Preston said. Nolan stopped. He did not look toward the Bugatti first. He looked at Emma, then shifted slightly so she was behind his shoulder. "I was told to pick up a payment signature from finance," he said. Preston's eyes dropped to the canvas tool bag in Nolan's hand. "That does not explain why you are carrying tools." Nolan glanced down as if the bag had become visible only because Preston mentioned it. "I came from another job." A few people nearby turned their heads. They saw the work shirt, the child, the tool bag, and the velvet rope around the silent car, and they understood just enough to misunderstand the rest. Preston lowered his voice. "This is not a roadside service call. That vehicle has specialists assigned." Nolan looked past him then, not at the paint, not at the chandelier, but at the rear quarter panel where the delayed relay had clicked again. "I can hear that," he said. Preston's face tightened. Evelyn Hart, still 40 feet away with the empty glass, noticed the change before she understood the reason for it. Nolan did not step closer. He did not offer credentials. He did not explain that 3 years earlier he had written transport recovery procedures for cars exactly like this after a prototype nearly lost its electronic handshake during unloading in New Jersey. He only waited, one hand resting lightly on Emma's backpack strap. Preston had spent 8 days proving the problem was impossible. Nolan needed 8 seconds to know where they had not looked. For 8 days, the pavilion had become less like a showroom and more like a very expensive waiting room. The first specialist arrived from the authorized service network with 2 hard cases, a spotless tablet, and the confidence of a man who had never been asked to fail in public. He checked the main battery array, ran a full diagnostic sweep, reset the startup sequence, and told Preston Vale the fault was likely software deep. By noon, the car remained silent. The second team flew in from Dallas and focused on the engine control unit. They swapped a module, updated a firmware package, verified the voltage curve, and produced a report with 11 pages of careful language that did not include the word answer. The third team came from New York with a specialist who had worked on limited production European hypercars for 16 years. He checked fuel pressure, starter relay response, sensor calibration, ignition authorization, and the drive module handshake. Every number seemed close enough to normal to be frustrating and far enough from normal to keep everyone afraid to sign off. On the 4th day, Preston authorized a full replacement of components no one truly believed were broken because expensive uncertainty often disguises itself as progress. The invoice grew. The patience in the room thinned. Evelyn stopped asking for updates in front of guests and began asking in a small side office with the door closed. Martin Keller watched the process from a respectful distance, saying less each day. He was not there to embarrass Hartwell Motors. He was there to protect the partnership, and every failed attempt made that harder. By the 6th day, the technicians had built a long list of everything the car was not. It was not the fuel pump. It was not the primary battery bank. It was not the starter relay. It was not the key authentication module. It was not the firmware version. It was not the cooling management software. It was not any of the elegant, expensive things men like Preston felt comfortable discussing in front of executives. At the bottom of the original pre-delivery checklist, under a section so routine most eyes moved past it, one line remained blank, rear isolation ground verified. Preston had seen the blank on day 1. He told himself the transport crew would have confirmed it before unloading. Then he told himself a ground issue would have shown cleaner symptoms. Then he stopped looking at it altogether. The car's warnings were too large now, too layered, too public. No one wanted the answer to be a cheap line on a checklist after $500,000 had already been spent proving it was something complicated. That was the shape of the failure Nolan walked into. Not stupidity. Not laziness. Something more dangerous. A room full of smart people had decided the problem must be worthy of the car's price, and once they decided that, every small answer began to look insulting. Nolan stood near the service corridor with Emma behind his shoulder, listening to Preston explain why he should leave, and watched the dashboard flicker once more through the open space between two specialists. The warning flashed and vanished too quickly for most people to notice. Nolan noticed. So did Preston. That was why Preston stepped farther into his path. The cheapest line on the checklist was still blank, and suddenly the wrong man had seen it. Nolan did not move toward the Bugatti right away. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed. Men had been circling that car for 8 days with the urgency of people trying to prove they were doing something. Nolan simply stood still. The pavilion noise thinned around him, glasses touching softly, shoes crossing stone, low investor voices pretending not to listen. He watched the dashboard through the gap between two technicians and waited for the flicker to come back. It did. Half a second of amber light, then nothing. A delayed relay clicked beneath the rear bodywork, not loud, not dramatic, just late enough to be wrong. Nolan tilted his head slightly. Emma looked up at him because she knew that look. It was the look he had when the old washing machine in their apartment made one strange sound and he knew which belt was slipping before opening the panel. Preston stepped closer. "You need to move away from the display area," he said. Nolan looked at the car, not at him. Was it lifted from the rear cradle during transport? The question landed strangely. It was too plain for the room. Too small. One of the specialists near the diagnostic station gave a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh. Another looked at Preston, waiting for him to dismiss it. Preston's hand tightened around the tablet. Evelyn saw that. She had spent years reading boardrooms, investors, rivals, nervous suppliers, men who lied with perfect posture, and she saw the smallest interruption in Preston's confidence. It was there and gone, but it was there. Nolan continued, still calm. The rear isolation ground was verified after unloading. Preston's voice sharpened. That is not your concern. Nolan nodded once, as if the answer itself had answered him. He looked toward the Bugatti again. The auxiliary fan cycled for 3 seconds, stopped, then tried again too soon. On a healthy startup sequence, that fan waited for a clean handshake between transport mode, chassis wake, and ignition authorization. This one was trying to wake a system that did not trust its own ground path. Nolan had seen it before, not on this car, but close enough. 3 years earlier in New Jersey, a prototype had arrived from an overseas crate with the same kind of ghost fault, a problem that looked expensive because the real failure was embarrassing. A lift point. A bracket. A connector seated just enough to pass a glance and loose enough to confuse everything downstream. Nolan had written a memo afterward. 2 pages. Simple language. Rear cradle lifts must be followed by isolation ground verification before startup. He had sent it through the proper channel. Preston had been copied. Preston had called it overly specific and removed it from the final procedure because rare problems made checklists look messy. Nolan remembered that too. He did not say it. Not yet. Evelyn set her empty glass on a passing tray without looking away from him. "What exactly are you hearing?" she asked. Preston turned toward her before Nolan could answer. "Miss Hart, with respect, he is temporary logistics help. He is not assigned to this vehicle." Emma's fingers closed around the blue toy car. Nolan felt the movement more than saw it. He lowered his hand gently to the strap of her backpack, steadying her without making a show of it. Then he looked at Evelyn for the first time. "You have 50 minutes before your presentation," he said. "If you want me to leave, I will wait at finance for my signature. If you want the car started, I need 5 minutes and nobody interrupting." The room heard a request. Preston heard a document he had buried. Preston did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The pavilion was full of people trained to hear authority even when it was spoken softly. "Absolutely not," he said, stepping fully between Nolan and the Bugatti. "This vehicle has been under factory-level diagnostic review for more than a week. We are not turning it over to temporary logistics help because he thinks he heard a relay. The words moved through the space cleaner than laughter and almost as sharp. A few guests near the velvet rope looked away with the practiced discomfort of people watching someone be dismissed in public. Emma lowered her eyes to the blue toy car in her hands. Nolan saw it. That was the part that reached him, not Preston's tone, not the title, not the insult hidden inside the word temporary. He had been called less by men who knew more and by men who knew nothing. It had never changed the work. But Emma had heard it, and for 1 second her small shoulders drew inward as if she were trying to take up less room in a building built to make people feel small. Nolan rested his hand lightly on her backpack strap and did not look at Preston when he answered. Then I will wait for my signature. He picked up the canvas tool bag from the floor. No anger. No performance. No attempt to explain himself to men who had already decided explanation would be an inconvenience. That steadiness bothered Preston more than argument would have. Evelyn noticed that too. She had spent the last 8 days watching experts defend theories that failed by blaming the problem's complexity. This man had offered one narrow question, one specific correction, and then the willingness to leave. Desperation usually made people louder. Nolan Mercer was not loud. Mr. Vale, Evelyn said, and the room changed its breathing. Preston turned to her, already preparing the reasonable expression he used in meetings. Miss Hart, allowing an unassigned contractor to touch this vehicle in front of the European delegation would create exposure we do not need. We already have exposure, Evelyn said. Her voice was even, but her eyes had moved to Emma, then back to Nolan. We have an $80 million presentation in less than an hour and a car that has made no sound for 8 days. Preston kept his smile tight. And that is exactly why we should not improvise. Nolan shifted the tool bag to his other hand. You do not need to improvise, he said quietly. You need to verify the one line nobody signed. Preston's face hardened. You do not know what has or has not been verified. Nolan looked at the diagnostic station. Rear isolation ground. The words were plain. Too plain. One of the specialists glanced down at the tablet before catching himself. Martin Keller, who had been standing near the far column with his hands folded behind his back, looked up for the first time in several minutes. Evelyn saw him move. Not much. Just enough. You have something to add, Mr. Keller, she asked. Martin did not answer immediately. He studied Nolan's face with the careful memory of a man searching through old files in his head. Then his expression changed, almost imperceptibly. New Jersey, he said. Nolan turned toward him. Preston's eyes flicked between them. Martin stepped away from the column, slow and deliberate. 3 years ago. Prototype delivery issue. Chassis would not wake after rear cradle transport. Everyone chased software for 2 days. He looked at Evelyn. A mechanic found the ground fault in under 10 minutes. The pavilion went quiet in a different way now. Evelyn looked at Nolan again, no longer seeing a man in the wrong room, but a man the room may have been wrong about. Preston opened his mouth, then closed it. Emma looked up at her father. Nolan said nothing. He had not asked to be believed. He had only asked whether they wanted the car started. Martin Keller did not speak loudly, but the pavilion adjusted around him as if his voice had weight built into it. He had spent 38 years around cars that cost more than buildings, and he had never needed to prove authority by filling a room with sound. He crossed the stone floor slowly, stopping beside the diagnostic station. Where Preston stood with the tablet still in his hand. I remember the New Jersey incident, Martin said. The prototype arrived with a wake sequence failure after rear cradle transport. 2 teams misread it as software. Mr. Mercer did not. Evelyn looked from Martin to Nolan. The name seemed to settle differently now. Not the unpaid contractor. Not the man with a child and a tool bag. Mr. Mercer. Preston recovered enough to say, that was a different vehicle. Martin nodded. Yes. Different vehicle. Same family of mistakes. The sentence was quiet, but it moved through Preston like a door closing. Nolan remained near Emma, one hand still on her backpack strap. He did not step forward until Evelyn asked the question directly. How long? Nolan looked at the Bugatti, then at the clock above the service corridor. 5 minutes, if no one interrupts me. One of the specialists folded his arms. Another looked away. Evelyn held Nolan's gaze for 2 seconds, then turned to Preston. Give him access. Preston's mouth tightened. Miss Hart, I strongly advise against allowing an unapproved procedure in front of the delegation. Martin looked at the tablet. The approved procedures have cost 8 days. No one added anything after that. Evelyn unclipped the pavilion access badge from Preston's station and held it out to Nolan. He took it without ceremony, then crouched in front of Emma. Stay with Mr. Keller, he said. Emma looked at the Bugatti, then back at him. Are you going to fix the blue car? Nolan's expression softened only for her. I am going to check something people forgot to check. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Martin stepped beside her, formal and gentle, and she held the toy car against her chest while Nolan walked toward the velvet rope. The guests shifted, not parting dramatically, just making enough space because uncertainty had changed sides. Nolan placed his canvas bag on the floor beside the rear quarter panel. He did not open the main engine cover. He did not ask for a new module. He did not request a factory laptop worth more than his truck. He pulled out a small light, a 1/4-inch driver, a clean cloth, and a grounding probe with a cracked rubber grip. Preston watched him with the expression of a man hoping the simplest answer would fail. Evelyn watched differently now. She watched the way a person watches a locked door after someone else says they have the key. Nolan knelt beside the rear access panel and paused for exactly one breath before beginning. For the first time all week, the room was quiet before the engine started. Nolan started the timer on the diagnostic tablet because he knew the room needed something simple to understand. 5 minutes did not sound like much until every second had witnesses. At 0 minutes and 12 seconds, he removed the rear access panel with 4 careful turns of the driver and set each fastener in a straight line on a clean cloth. At 0 minutes and 40 seconds, his light found the rear isolation ground strap. It was there, which was why every checklist glance had passed over it, but it was not seated cleanly. The bracket had shifted less than 1/4 of an inch, just enough to pull the connector into an angle that looked attached while starving the wake sequence of trust. Nolan did not announce it. He reached for the grounding probe, touched the contact, watched the reading settle wrong, then looked once at the underside of the rear cradle. A faint polished mark showed where the transport lift had kissed the wrong point during unloading. Preston saw it at the same time. His face changed before he could stop it. At 1 minute and 30 seconds, Nolan loosened the bracket, not fully, only enough to let the strap rest where it had been designed to rest. At 2 minutes, he cleaned the contact with the edge of the cloth and a small amount of electrical cleaner from his bag. No new module. No flown-in part. No expensive theory. Just metal, contact, and the kind of patience that does not look impressive from across a room until everything else has failed. Emma stood beside Martin Keller beyond the velvet rope, holding her blue toy car with both hands. She did not understand ground paths or startup authorization, but she understood her father's face. He looked the same way he did at the kitchen table when fixing her broken pencil sharpener, calm. Enough to make a hard thing feel ordinary. At 2 minutes and 45 seconds, Nolan reseated the connector and set the bracket straight by a few millimeters. At 3 minutes and 10 seconds, he asked for the tablet. Preston hesitated, then handed it over because Evelyn was watching him now. Nolan did not look at the older fault stack. He went directly to the transport recovery sequence, opened the manual override, and selected the order the car had been waiting to hear. Chassis wake. Ground verification. Transport mode exit. Ignition authorization. At 4 minutes, the dashboard changed first. The amber warning flickered once, then cleared. A soft tone sounded from the cockpit, small and almost polite. One of the specialists leaned forward. Martin did not move. Evelyn's hand closed around the edge of the display table. Preston stared at the rear cradle mark as if the floor beneath him had become uncertain. At 4 minutes and 59 seconds, Nolan slid into the driver's seat, placed one hand on the wheel, and looked through the windshield toward Emma. She lifted the blue toy car half an inch, as if giving him permission. Nolan pressed the start control. The room held its breath. The engine did not roar at first. It woke. A low electrical pulse moved through the cabin, the dashboard swept clean, and then the Bugatti answered with a deep, controlled sound that rolled across the pavilion floor and climbed into the chandelier light. It was not chaos. It was precision returning to itself. The champagne glasses on the nearest service tray trembled slightly. A conversation near the investor table stopped in the middle of a sentence. Someone behind the velvet rope drew in a breath and forgot to let it out. Nolan kept his hand on the wheel for 2 seconds after the engine settled, listening not for applause, but for the rhythm beneath the sound. Stable idle. Clean response. No warning cascade. The car was alive because the fault had never been mysterious. It had only been ignored. He shut the engine down once, restarted it through the proper recovery sequence, and watched the display remain clear. Only then did he step out. No one clapped. Not yet. The room had not caught up with what it had seen. 8 days, $500,000, 4 teams, 12 specialists, and the answer had been a shifted bracket, a bad ground path, and a blank line on a checklist. Evelyn Hart set her empty glass down on the edge of the nearest table with such care that the small contact of glass against stone seemed louder than it should have. Martin Keller smiled, barely, the expression of a man who had just watched competence arrive without announcing itself. Preston Vale stared at the diagnostic tablet. The cleared warning log was reflected faintly in his eyes, but there was nothing left on the screen that could protect him. The rear cradle mark was still there. The blank checklist line was still there. The memo he had removed from procedure 3 years earlier was suddenly in the room even though no one had printed it. Emma was the first person to smile. She stepped close to the velvet rope and placed her blue toy car carefully on the edge of the display barrier, facing the real one, as if the small car had been waiting for the larger one to wake up. Nolan saw her and the hard line in his face softened for half a second. Then he picked up the 4 fasteners from the cloth, put the access panel back exactly as he had found it, and packed his tools before anyone asked him to explain. That was when the applause began, scattered at first, then fuller, delayed by embarrassment as much as relief. Evelyn did not join it. She was looking at Nolan, at the tool bag, at his daughter, at the car her experts could not start, and at Preston standing silently beside the tablet. The engine had been loud. The silence around Preston was louder. Evelyn waited until the applause had faded before she crossed the pavilion floor. She did not send Preston. She did not send an assistant. She walked to Nolan herself, slowly enough that people noticed and quietly enough that the moment did not become a performance. Nolan had already zipped the canvas tool bag and lifted Emma's backpack from beside Martin Keller. Emma held the blue toy car close again, but now she was standing taller, her eyes moving between the Bugatti and her father as if she had just learned something important about both. Evelyn stopped 3 feet from Nolan. The chandelier light caught the edge of her black dress, the polished floor, the car's blue paint, and the space between them where the insult from earlier still seemed to hang. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and this time she used his name carefully. "I owe you an apology." Nolan looked at her, then at Emma, then back again. He did not make her repeat it. He did not look toward Preston. He did not turn the room into a courtroom. "Your finance office owes me a signature," he said quietly. For a second, Evelyn did not understand. Then she did, and the smallest trace of shame moved across her face. She turned to the assistant nearest the service corridor. "Pay the invoice now. Full amount. Add emergency diagnostic compensation." Nolan shook his head once. "Pay the invoice. We can discuss the rest in writing." Martin Keller's smile returned, small and approving. Evelyn nodded. She had negotiated with investors, suppliers, manufacturers, and men who mistook volume for leverage, but Nolan's calm made the usual language feel cheap. "Then let us discuss it properly," she said. "Hartwell Motors needs someone who can handle crisis diagnostics without politics getting in the way. I would like to offer you a lead technical contract." Preston shifted behind her. No one looked at him, which somehow made it worse. Nolan glanced toward the Bugatti, now sitting clean and silent under the lights. "I have conditions." Evelyn did not hesitate. "Name them." "Clear authority when safety or procedure is involved. Written reporting lines. No buried checklist changes. No unpaid invoices. And I leave on time when my daughter needs me." Emma looked up at him, surprised by being included in a sentence that sounded so official. Evelyn looked at the child too, and something in her posture softened. "Agreed," she said. Not because it was generous, but because after 8 days of expensive failure, the terms sounded less like demands than the cost of finally listening. Behind them, Martin stepped closer to Evelyn and spoke low enough that only those nearby heard. "You spent $500,000 to learn what he heard in 5 minutes." Evelyn did not answer. She did not need to. Across the pavilion, Preston stood beside the diagnostic station while a compliance director quietly requested the original procedure files. The audit would come later. The presentation would begin on time. The partnership would survive. But the room had already changed. Nolan lifted the tool bag onto his shoulder and took Emma's hand. As they walked toward the service door, the Bugatti remained behind them under the chandelier, running clean in the memory of everyone who had watched it wake. Evelyn stood in the white stone silence and understood the lesson too late to pretend she had taught it. Money had brought the best specialists to the room, but dignity, patience, and a father who actually listened had started the car.